We got Robin in Washington, D.C., pronouns are he, him, who says that neutrality to belief in God is not possible logically. Well, I don't. How is it impossible logically, Robin, for someone to be neutral on the position of whether or not they're convinced there's a God? I'm not convinced there's a God, but that doesn't mean that I'm convinced there's not a God. Where am I logically wrong?
Hello.
Robin, did you go off and take a nap?
I'm sorry, I might have cut out. Am I good now?
Yep, you're here. Welcome.
All right, sorry about that. Yes, so yeah, the position that no one is neutral towards God. Yes, so everyone operates under a metaphysical framework, meaning that they're going to operate under a set of assumptions or a set of beliefs that they hold to that are going to answer questions such as, what does it mean for things to be facts? What does it mean for things to be true, false, possible, impossible, etc.? Everyone's going to be operating under some metaphysical framework.
Well, I wouldn't call it a metaphysical framework. I'd call it an epistemological framework.
No. Metaphysical, what does it mean for things to be facts? That's ontology. Or things to be possible or impossible. That's ontology, not epistemology. So metaphysical framework, that is what, generally speaking, that's what we're going to be talking about when it comes to how people operate. So everyone operates under some metaphysical framework, even if they cannot fully articulate it. Now,
sure.
Because of the nature of metaphysical frameworks, whatever framework that they hold to, if they believe that their framework is true, then they're going to be forced to reject anything that is not the metaphysical framework that they hold to. So when it comes to belief in God, God is in the category of a metaphysical framework.
So,
or a metaphysical
Robin, rejecting a claim does not mean accepting its contrary. I can reject. So like somebody can come and tell me that Arden committed a crime, and I can say, I do not believe that because the burden of proof hasn't been met yet. But that is not equivalent to me saying Arden is innocent.
That's not what I'm talking about. I said, if you believe something is true, then you're going to believe its negation is false. It's logically necessary that you have to believe its negation is false.
Yes, but I'm saying if I'm not convinced that something is true, that does not mean that I'm convinced that it's false. Wait, we lost him.
Oh.
Well, I guess we just lost the call. So I will, in case he calls back, stand moderately corrected because I misheard him. And so I suppose it is a metaphysical framework as to whether or not, or as to the definitions of what is or isn't a fact. But the position on God is about epistemology, not ontology. And so God is a claim, and you have some framework that determines whether or not you are convinced that that claim is true. And the mere fact that I'm not convinced that claim is true does not mean that I am in fact convinced that it's false. If I am convinced it is true, I cannot then also be convinced it's false. But this is why we use propositional logic. The proposition is some God exists. You either accept that or you reject it. But if you reject the proposition some God exists, that does not mean that you accept the contrary proposition that no gods exist.
Yeah, by that standard, you would have to spend your entire life debunking every asinine thing that people claim to believe in. Because if you don't believe it, then it must be you're rejecting it, and you have some sort of burden of proof there.
Yeah, and to be fair, I'm not neutral towards a God. I'm not saying that I'm stuck 50-50. I'm saying that I am not convinced that a God exists. I'm open to being convinced. I am not convinced that God exists. And for any given God that I maybe haven't heard of or whatever else, I may also not be convinced that God doesn't exist. But there are gods that I am convinced don't exist if they have properties that contradict nature. Hopefully, we'll get that call back.
A few moments later.
I'm happy to say that Robin's back with us. So we did our promo, Robin. I don't know what you heard while you were gone, but let's try this again.
Yes.
So in propositional logic, there's a proposition, some God exists. I can accept that proposition, which means that I am convinced that it's true or likely true, or I can not accept that proposition, which means that I am not convinced it's true. But if I don't accept it, that does not mean that I accept the proposition that no gods exist. Are we at least in agreement there?
Yes, I'm familiar with that. Yes, but I'm talking more on the grounds or on the basis that whenever we're operating, we're operating under a metaphysical framework. Okay.
I don't see how that changes. So the thing here is you're claiming that neutrality toward God is impossible. And I just described, well, I don't know, what I described may not be neutrality in the way that you think about it, but we just acknowledged that it's possible for someone to not be convinced that a God exists and for them to not be convinced that that God doesn't exist. Now, if you're talking about a different type of neutrality, then I guess we need a definition of that.
Oh, okay. I didn't. So when you said that, I agreed to something, but that's not what I meant to agree to. So I take back my agreement to what you just said then.
Okay. So there's a proposition that some God exists, and some people will accept that proposition, and some people will not accept that proposition. Can we at least agree with that?
Yes.
And those are the only two options. You either accept the proposition or you do not accept the proposition.
Correct.
Now, for the people who do not accept the proposition, some of them may also accept the contrary proposition that no God exists, but not all of those people have to accept that, correct?
Well, that what you just said is not true if we're going to conceive of God as some sort of an ultimate metaphysical grounds for things.
I'm sorry, but what God is or how you conceive of God is irrelevant to that question.
Yeah.
This is about, for the category of people who do not accept proposition A, some of them may accept proposition not A, and some of them may also not be convinced of proposition not A. It is possible to be, like, for example, proposition O.J. Simpson murdered Nicole. It's possible to not be convinced that that is true and to not be convinced that that is false, correct?
Yes.
Okay, that's all I'm saying. Why is it that the proposition some God exists is different in your scenario than one about a murderer?
Because God is in the category, at least the one I'm talking about, is in the category of a metaphysical context or worldview. And so if everyone has a worldview or metaphysical framework, then then whatever framework that they hold to being true, then every other framework they're going to have to reject as being false. If you hold that X is true, then you have to believe not X is false.
I agree, but not being convinced that a proposition is true does not mean that you must be convinced that it's false. If you're convinced that a God exists, you can't simultaneously be convinced that it doesn't exist, because that would be irrational. But if I'm not convinced that a God exists, I can also not be convinced that that God doesn't exist.
Yeah, but do you understand that if we have, okay, I'll just walk through this. So when I said earlier that everyone has a metaphysical framework, a framework of reality. It's ultimately going to answer questions like, what does it mean for things to be facts? Why are facts the facts? What does it mean for things to be true, false, possible, impossible? You accept that everyone has a metaphysical framework that they're operating under, right?
I don't know that that's necessarily true, or how it changes this, because I'm talking about propositional logic.
I know that, but so there are certain things that we can be neutral about, and there are certain things that we cannot be neutral about. What I'm trying to explain is that the things that we cannot be neutral about are things such as all-encompassing worldviews. Okay,
I don't agree that that is possible. I am not convinced that your metaphysical assertion is true. I'm also not convinced that it's false. You need to make the case for one or the other.
Okay. I'll do so by analogy. So do you agree that in order for an ethical framework to make any sense at all, that we need to have a meta-ethical framework, which is going to answer questions like, what does it mean for things to be good or bad, or that we should or should not do things? If we don't,
I don't know. I don't know, and I don't know how that's relevant to what we're talking about, because we're not talking about an ethical framework. We're talking about whether or not a God exists. A God is a proposition about something that is either real or not.
I'm comparing a metaphysical framework to a meta-ethical framework, and just this scope is a scope in this analogy, okay?
It won't make any difference because analogies aren't perfect. Why can't you stick with the one? What is this? What is it special about God that says you cannot be both? You cannot be both not convinced it exists and not convinced it doesn't exist. What is special about a God?
Because he's in the category of a metaphysical context, which
You've said that 3 or 4 times. Did you think I missed that? Please explain it. Just stating it is not an explanation.
that's why I'm giving an analogy.
I don't want an analogy. I want you to explain how God is excluded from the basics of proper fucking logic.
Okay. If we don't have a metaphysical framework that's going to answer questions like, what does it mean for things to be facts? And when you invoke a fact, then it's going to be meaningless, okay? Because we don't understand what does it mean for things to be facts. Same with things being false or possible or impossible, okay? Because they don't have a ground.
Robin, I genuinely don't give a fuck. I agree that we have to have some understanding of what is and isn't a fact. I've asked repeatedly, and this is the last time I'm going to ask. What God are you advocating for, and why is that God exempted from not being convinced and not being convinced?
Because then if you agree to that, and if God is a metaphysical context, it's going to answer those questions, okay? Then whatever metaphysical framework you hold to is either going to be the God framework or the not God framework.
No, sir. That's an assertion about a particular type of God that you are declaring is required because you are using God as a grounding for a metaphysical framework. But I don't accept that metaphysical framework, you see? I don't accept a metaphysical framework that is grounded upon God because there isn't sufficient evidence to accept that metaphysical framework.
You're not focusing on what I said.
All right, then you should email and put up an argument, because this is making no sense to anybody, and we're all tired of hearing you say metaphysical over and over and avoiding the question. There is a proposition, and that proposition is some God exists. Are you going to define that God for us?
I just did. I said that God is defined.
No, sir, you did not. No, sir, you did not, and we're done.
I said that multiple.
Yeah, I mean,
I've
wouldn't
moved
a
on.
metaphysical framework, quote unquote, be composed of like claims? Isn't that kind of like, I don't know.
Yeah, you can say that God is part of a metaphysical framework all you want, and that does not explain how your God is somehow exempted from.
Well,
it's really straightforward. And the easy way that we know that Robin's wrong is that it's entirely possible for a human being to not understand something and therefore to not be convinced either way. That is simply just a fact. That there are, and that's probably what he's going to claim. Oh, Matt just didn't understand it. Well, if I don't understand it, then I am not convinced either way, which refutes your assertion that you cannot be neutral on it. I don't understand